All right, so we're in Great Gatsby Chapter 5. We have just finally found out how Gatsby and Daisy are connected. So that was kind of one of the really big pieces from Chapter 4 as we finally learn Gatsby's background. Gatsby tells us that he's an Oxford man, he was in the war, um, and we find out that he and Daisy were madly in love. And then he went off to war. She decided to marry Tom, who's got the money. Remember the night before her wedding, she's crying tears. She gets this mysterious letter, and it seems like she might not go through with it. And then the next day, she does. The marriage is happy for a little bit, but not for very long. And so then she finds out that Tom, isn't the man that she thought he was, but YOLO, you only live once. Only now that's not quite such a nice theme for us to have, and instead that theme really represents this idea of once you make a choice, you can't go back and undo that choice. We also get these weird little subtle hints that maybe Gatsby is in the mafia or engaged in some sort of organized crime. He's got money. He can get out of a ticket from the police and stuff. He meets this weird, creepy dude named Wolfsheim. So, okay, so we're starting in chapter 5, page 81. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2:00, and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which felt unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints on the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first I thought it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into a hide-and-go-seek or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown open to the game. But there wasn't a sound. Only wind in the trees which blew the wires and made the lights go off and on again, as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across the lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes around towards it absently. "I've been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport, in my car." "It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer." "I've got to go to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. "I talked with Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble." "What day would suit you?" "What day would suit you," he corrected me quickly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see." "How about the day after tomorrow?" He considered it for a moment, then with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suppose that he meant my grass. "There's another little thing," he said uncertainly and hesitated. "Would you rather put it off for a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't about that, at least." He fumbled with a series of beginnings. "Why, I thought, why, look here, old sport, you don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't, if you'll pardon my... You see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand, and I thought that if you didn't make very much... You're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport?" "Trying to." "Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing." I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. "I've got my hands full," I said. "I'm much obligated, I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any more work." "You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim." Evidently, he thought I was shying away from the gargantuan mentioned at lunch. But I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door, so I don't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island, or for how many hours he glanced into rooms, while his house blazed gaudily on. I called up Daisy from the office the next morning and invited her to come to tea. Don't bring Tom, I warned her. What? Don't bring Tom. Who is Tom? She asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat, dragging a lawnmower, tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among soggy, whitewashed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's, with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie, hurried in. He was pale. There were dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. Is everything all right? He asked immediately. The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean. What grass? He inquired blankly. Oh, the grass in the yard. He looked out the window at it, but judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. It looks very good, he remarked vaguely. One of the papers said that they thought the rain would stop about 4. I think it was the Journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea? I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the Finn. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. Will they do? I asked. Of course, they're fine, he yellowed hollowly. Old sport. The rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist, through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished trend that shook the kitchen floor, and peering toward a bleared window from time to time as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why's that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there were something pressing demanding on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and a little harrowed myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac tree, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a 3-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down with my ear alone, before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Reckonet. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy. Then she gave a grave murmur. His name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as if there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door against the increasing rain. For half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then, from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, and followed by Daisy's voice in a clear, artificial tone. "I'm certain I'm awfully glad to see you again." A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclined against the mantelpiece in a strange counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. "We've met before," muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his hand, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. "I'm sorry about the clock," he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of the 1,000 in my head. "It's an old clock," I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. "We haven't met for many years," said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. 5 years next November." The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen when the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow, and, while Daisy and I talked, looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back." "I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh, God," in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake." "You're just embarrassed, that's all." And luckily I added, "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed?" he repeated incredulously. "Just as much as you are." "Don't talk so loud." "You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and opening the door cautiously went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black knotted tree, whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaved by Gatsby's gardener, abounded in small, muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it, like Kant at his church steeple, for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze, a decade before, and there was a story that he agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps their refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry. After half an hour the sun shone again, and the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servants' dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaning from a large central bay, spat meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little now and then with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house, too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen, short of pushing over the stove. But I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word or a gesture of exultation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. "Oh, well, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. "It stopped raining." "Has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room. He smiled like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that? It stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat, full of aching, grieving beauty, told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You're sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face. Too late, I thought, with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited in the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. Yes, his eyes went over it, every arched door, every square tower. "It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically. "But I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war." I think he hardly knew what he was saying, for when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it wasn't an appropriate reply. "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either one now." He looked at me with more attention. "Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night?" Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. "That huge place there?" she cried, pointing. "Do you like it?" "I love it, but I don't see how you could live there all alone." "I always keep it full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things, celebrated people." Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect or that feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling odor of jonquils, the frothy odor of hawthorn and plume blossoms, the pale gold odor of kiss me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs through period bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender silk, and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms with sunken baths. intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath and an Adams study, where we sat down and drank a glass of chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't when I try to." He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets, which held his massed suits and dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. "I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall." He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them one by one before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids and coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strange sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." And so I'm just going to pause there. I need to get a drink. But more importantly, I think this is a good place to kind of go back and reevaluate the transition between Daisy and Gatsby's reaction at finally being reunited. So really, this is a great place to reflect on the theme of you only live once, that you can't relive the past. And so one opportunity would be to compare the other one would be like, the anticipation is better than the actual achieving of a goal, right? Gatsby had built up this meeting so much in his mind. Did it live up to his expectations? For Daisy, she married Tom because he was the man who has the money. We know she was questioning her marriage before she got married. She was crying, but she went through with it, and now she sees everything that Gatsby was able to amass. So maybe we're starting to see some regret here. So just kind of go back through, think about their relationship, the awkwardness of meeting each other again for the first time in 5 years, and then how that kind of changes as they're going through Gatsby's house. You could also think about the materialistic culture as an unhealthy culture. Does it seem like Gatsby really cares about all the stuff that he has as he's taking them through? I'm going to get a drink and then we'll finish the next section.